Well, good afternoon, and thank you for coming. Thank you for coming for our first endowed lecture of the spring semester. Before we get started, I wanted to remind you that we have two more of these endowed lectures. We have the Stewart lecture occurring next Wednesday and the Hall lecture the Wednesday after that. So I hope you'll put it on your calendar and come out to two other, what should be tremendous lecture and addresses. Thank you for joining us today for the Ralph F. Fuchs Lecture. The Fuchs Lectureship in Law was established in 1993 to honor Professor Ralph Fuchs, a distinguished and respected member of our faculty from 1945 until his death in 1985. The professor was an accomplished teacher and scholar and a pioneering scholar in the area of administrative law. But he was equally well known for his lifelong commitment to public service and for the dedication, creativity, and compassion that he brought to that work. He was the first chairman of the executive board of the Indiana Civil Liberties Union, active in the NAACP, and was appointed to its state committee on legal redress. He was also deeply committed to defending the rights of free speech, free press, and free assembly in the university context, eventually becoming president of the American Association of University Professors. Past Fuchs lectures have included some of the nation's top lawyers and legal scholars with a deep commitment to public service. They include William Gold, former chairman of the National Labor Relations Board, Morris Dees, civil rights lawyer and co-founder of the Southern Poverty Law Center, Elliot Milstein, professor of law at Washington College of Law and past president of the American Association of Law Schools, Jerry Kang, a vice chancellor and professor at law at UCLA, Letty Volpe, a professor from UC Berkeley, and last year, Professor Tracy Mears from Yale Law School. It is an honor to add to that very distinguished list of speakers, Lee Gelernt, the Deputy Director of ACLU's National Immigrants' Rights Project and the Director of the project's program on access to the courts. Lee has had simply an amazing career dedicated to public service, one that Professor Fuchs would have admired. While he's perhaps most well known for his recent work bringing the first challenge to the Trump administration's travel ban, and at least for my daughter appearing on Samantha Bee's Bunker Talk show, he has had a long career focused on immigration, civil rights, and national security issues, going back to when he began with the ACLU in 1992. Among his professional achievements, he has argued literally dozens of groundbreaking civil rights cases at all levels of the federal court system. He has testified as an expert before the United States Senate on habeas corpus and issues of judicial review, and he has served as one of the very few human rights observers at Guantanamo Bay for the very first military trial conducted there by the United States since World War II. In addition to his work at the ACLU, he is an adjunct faculty member at Columbia Law School, and he also serves as a visiting lecturer at Yale Law School. He's received numerous honors over the years, including the Public Interest Achievement Award from Columbia University's Public Interest Law Foundation, and the American Immigration Lawyers Association has twice awarded him with their National Prize for Excellence. He earned his law degree from Columbia, his master's in international relations from the London School of Economics, and before joining the ACLU, he clerked for the late Judge Frank Coffin of the First Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals. I'm particularly grateful he came out because one of my very first jobs in law school was to work for Lee. He's a brilliant writer, and I was incredibly grateful for having the opportunity to work with him at the Immigrants' Rights Project. Please join me in warmly welcoming Lee Gelernt as this year's Fuchs Lecturer.
Thank you all for having me here. This is really an honor. And I want to thank the Dean for that nice introduction. If he hadn't added, I was going to say that probably my biggest achievement was supervising the Dean in one of his first law school jobs. And so glad that he has surpassed me now and the Dean of a major law school. So what I thought I would do is talk to you very little about how I got started in immigration at the ACLU, a little bit about sort of just a quick overview of my career, and then talk to you about what's been happening the last year litigating against the Trump administration, and maybe at the end a few remarks about how I see being a public interest lawyer and maybe just a lawyer generally, and hope to leave some time for some questions at the end, because I really would love to hear what's on your mind as current law students, how you're seeing the current climate, the current situation, and all that. So hopefully the Dean will nod to me when it's time for questions. So I have been at the ACLU a long time. I used to think it hadn't been that long, but now I've sort of realized I can no longer say I just got there. I've been there now litigating at the ACLU, 25 plus years. And when I started, when I was in law school, immigration wasn't the hot topic it was now. Very few law schools, I think, had actually an immigration program, either a class or a clinic. I did no immigration when I was in law school, didn't do any when I was clerking, I don't think, and wasn't specifically looking to do immigrants' rights. I had sort of I knew I wanted to do civil rights, public interest work, and I had a more general civil rights background, doing discrimination cases, doing death penalty cases. My first summer I went down south to do capital work. My second summer was more general civil rights. And I think that's what I was looking to do. And a job opened up at the ACLU in the Immigrants' Rights Project, the National Office at ACLU, and I decided it was a good fit for me because it fit the criteria for me, which was I wanted to do race and poverty work. And I viewed immigration back then, and I still do, more so probably, as essentially about race and poverty. So it was a good fit. And I think also from a selfish standpoint, I wanted to do work that I thought was going to be intellectually challenging, and immigration was that and has continued to be that. I think in large part because so many cutting-edge constitutional issues start in the immigration field, because it's where the government feels like, well, let's see if this floats, at least in the immigration area where non-citizens have less rights, and then perhaps we can move on. So throughout my career, I've worked on issues around habeas corpus, for example. And for many, many years, Congress had toyed with eliminating federal court jurisdiction over various areas of the law, but it always pulled back. And then finally in 1996, they decided to actually do it and significantly curtail federal court jurisdiction in a civil rights area, and in this case where someone's liberty was at stake. And so that's an issue I've been working on now 20 plus years, where it's immigration, but it's not nitty-gritty immigration. It's just a lot of federal court jurisdiction, civil rights issues. So for me, that has been an added bonus. Over my course of my career, I think what I've worked on has changed a little bit. When I first got there in the early 90s, immigration was largely a federal issue, and so all the litigation I did was principally against the federal government, challenging federal legislation. Then when 9/11 hit, I largely did national security work for a bunch of years. The ACLU did not even have a national security project at the time, and most of what was happening was directed toward non-citizens, so it sort of naturally fell on the Immigrants' Rights Project to do that work. And I would say I did 85% of my work for the next sort of 4 or 5 years in national security area. And now, we have the Trump administration, and so that is obviously pulling me back. Some national security, but primarily immigrants' rights. And the one thing I think that's also changed over the years is that even within the immigration work, it's not strictly against the federal government. As you all know, there is a lot of immigration activity at the state and local level. And that has been a significant change in the work we do, the state affiliates do for the ACLU, and the national office does. And that takes up a lot of time. And that started, 7, 8 years ago more. Arizona passed a sweeping law. And at that time, one of the differences was that the Obama administration came in on our side. Recently, with the Trump administration, they've been coming in on the state side. And I want to talk to you a little about an anti-sanctuary law called SB 4 that Texas passed, and a little bit of the issues that raises. But what I thought is maybe I just sort of start chronologically with what's happened in the past year. And needless to say, it's been a busy year. I'd say it's the busiest. I've been busy a lot over the last 25 years, and I'd say this has been the busiest. And so let me start with the first travel ban, and you all sort of probably know the story, but let me just sort of set it up a little and give you maybe a sort of 2 seconds behind the scenes of what happened with the first travel ban. the president had been talking about a travel ban for a while, and after he was elected, he continued to talk about it, so we started gearing up, anticipating that it would happen. And what we anticipated, though, was that the travel ban would affect only people overseas. And right after he was inaugurated, that week, that was the 20th of January, some drafts of the travel ban got leaked or put out. And they were pretty much what we anticipated, right, barring immigrants and refugees from certain select countries. And so we started gearing up for a lawsuit. The travel ban, the official version, the executive order, was actually issued Friday, the 27th, about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, 1 week after he was inaugurated. And so we had a strategy session with other groups that we were talking to about litigation from 7 to 9:30 that night, anticipating that we would have to file a lawsuit very quickly, but it didn't have to be done immediately, and we were looking to do about a week out. And again, looking back naively, we anticipated that it would only affect people who were overseas. Around 10 o'clock that night, we started getting texts saying that there were people at JFK who were being detained. And so we scrambled to try and find out whether it was a sort of normal type holdups or it had something to do with the travel ban. And it turned out, we quickly found out that it was because of the travel ban, and that the first two individuals we found out about were two Iraqis, one who had worked for the U.S. military for ages, the other whose wife had worked for the U.S. military for ages, and needed to get out of there because they were in serious, serious danger. We then learned that there were people all around the country at U.S. airports, and these were individuals who had been vetted forever, and obviously in the case of these two Iraqis, had worked for our U.S. military, so they were known quantities. They had been given visas. They got on the plane that morning. En route, the president signed the travel ban. When they landed, they were told, no, you can no longer enter. President Trump, a few hours ago, signed this ban. And as we now know, there was not a lot of coordination between the administration, even within the administration, but certainly not information given to attorneys within the Justice Department, much less people on the ground in the airports. So all these individuals were detained. We decided we need to file a lawsuit quickly, so we stayed up all night and filed a lawsuit about 6 in the morning, a habeas corpus petition. And what we were principally trying to do at that point was keep people who had reached the U.S. in the country and litigate the constitutionality of the travel ban as to them, and we figured we would amend the lawsuit later to bring in people who were still overseas. And so at 6 in the morning, we started trying to reach people in the administration, and we quickly realized we didn't actually know too many people in the administration. We couldn't reach anybody who had authority. We tried the U.S. Attorney's Office in Brooklyn. We couldn't, because that covers JFK, where a lot of the people were coming in. They had no idea what was going on and certainly had no authority to do anything. What we were looking to do is get an agreement that they wouldn't remove anybody who reached U.S. soil back to their countries, because obviously they would be in danger and potentially we wouldn't be able to get them relief. So we wanted to keep them in the country till the court could set up an orderly schedule to hear the constitutionality of the first travel ban. When we didn't reach anybody by noon, we started preparing a stay motion to say keep them in the country at least till Monday, if not. And we filed that around 5 o'clock. And the whole day, I think partly being sleep deprived, partly just being oblivious to what was going on, I sort of was watching out of the corner of my eye that there were all these protests starting around the country, especially at the airports, and that there were law students and lawyers and other people going out to the airports to help the detainees to protest, and the networks and MSNBC and were all carrying it live, and it was becoming a huge thing. But I still wasn't, I don't think I was fully sort of grasping what was going on. We filed the papers about 5 o'clock, and it turned out the emergency judge for the Eastern District of New York happened to be still in her chambers at between 5 and 5:30, and she said, get down here by 7:30. This is Saturday, right? It's 8 days from when he was inaugurated, 24 hours from when the ban was enacted. Get down here. It's Saturday night, but get down here. This is important, and we're going to have a hearing at 7:30 and call whoever you can call from the government. So we reached the U.S. Attorney's Office. They said, we'll be here, and we'll try and find someone from DOJ in Washington to be on the phone. And so I shaved, showered, said, I'm heading down to court, and told my wife and kids, I think I'll be back quickly. I don't think it's going to be that big a deal. And I got down there, and there were about 40 people outside the court, and it was a cold Saturday night, and I think, wow, this is great. 40 people are here to support us. The judge waited till about 8:30 so the courtroom could fill up, and she said, this is important, it's public, and we're going to have an open courtroom, and there were about a third press, a third community groups, and a third lawyers. And we came into court, and the lawyer for DOJ was on the phone, and I think, in fairness to her, I think she was caught a little off guard by this whole thing. Certainly didn't appear that she had been preparing for months to defend the legality of it. And it was one of those sort of really tense hearings, and I've, over the years I've done cases that are fairly high profile, but they tend to be sort of very staid and like all sort of federal court actions. And this took on a sort of surreal tone. I mean, partly because it was Saturday night, partly because it was the Muslim ban, the press had all got wind of it. And the judge came in, and she was very pointed and matter of fact with her, and said, I have 2 questions for the lawyer on the phone from the government. Can you tell me that if I send these 2 Iraqi men back to Iraq and all the other people have reached U.S. soil, that they are not going to be in serious harm if I send them back? And to her credit, the lawyer from DOJ said, I can't give you any assurances that they won't be in serious danger. The judge said, I want to ask you a second question. Can you tell me, given that these 2 individuals work for our U.S. military, they've been vetted forever, as have the other people who reach U.S. soil, that if I keep them in the country just long enough for me to hear this case, that they're going to be a danger to the United States? And the lawyer for the government said, all I can tell you right now is that President Trump thinks they're going to be a danger. And the judge said, okay, Mr. Gelernt, let me hear from you. And so I argued a little bit, and then and I said, not only do we need a stay, but we also need the names of other people who have reached U.S. soil. They're all being held in detention in the airports. We don't know who they are. We don't know whether they have any way to contact lawyers. And we also, if you're going to issue the stay, we need you to tell the government lawyers who are here today to alert everyone on the ground immediately that you've issued a stay, because we don't want to lag time between when you issue the stay and people are sent on planes. And then it sort of took on a sort of TV movie type thing, which I was not prepared for. At one point, a lawyer from the audience came rushing up, which is not something you all ought to do, and rushing up to me at counsel table and handed me a note, like literally like at a TV movie. I said, Your Honor, I've just been handed a note, And the note said, my client is on a plane that's about to take off in a half hour to Syria. She'll be in serious danger. And the judge said, okay, well, in light of that, I'm going to issue my ruling right here from the bench very quickly. And she said, I'm issuing a nationwide stay. And then the audience broke out in applause. It was like a whole Cousin Vinnie kind of, And, it was just something that was really kind of surreal. And so that was fantastic. And the whole time I'm up there, I'd sort of not thinking about what's going outside. And when we were walking out, I sort of thought maybe some of those 40 people are still out there. And when we got out there, maybe some of you have seen videos of it or saw it live that night, there were between 1,000 and 2,000 people out there in front of the courthouse cheering and going crazy. And Chris Hayes from MSNBC was out in front live on one of the shows by phone saying, what happened? And just everyone sort of exploded. And I remember sort of sneaking off for a second and calling my wife and saying, I'm going to be home a little later than I thought. It's kind of turned into a big deal. And she said, yeah, I know. We're watching live on MSNBC. And, and the reason I bring it up is, both because it was an exciting moment and, it'll never happen again. It never happened in the 25 years before. I remember that there was a young lawyer who had just started a couple of months earlier with us who was one of the lawyers in court with me, and I said, this is how it is all the time when you walk out, right? But the reason I wanted to mention this is because I think a couple of things. One is, I think in my 25 plus years, this is the closest I've come to sort of having one of those real civil rights moments. I think as any experienced civil rights advocate will tell you, it is very hard to accomplish everything you want to accomplish strictly with legal actions in court. There has to be some type of movement around it, right? And you all have seen footage of the 60s, right? And that was the classic civil rights moment. I'm not suggesting we've come anywhere close to reaching that level. But I think it was important for us as lawyers to feel like now we had this coordinated effort and that we would be going into court, there would be this movement behind us, and it was really important. It was definitely a feeling like we have this type of movement, and we're not. In the past, there have been small movements around cases I've done, but they haven't sort of been movements as much as a little bit of that. And maybe that's, our fault as the lawyers at the ACLU with public interest generally that we haven't been able to generate that type of thing. But it's been important. And so seeing all those people outside the court was really heartening. And I think there were a lot of people out there who were there because for them the Muslim ban was really bad. But there were a lot of people out there, I think, who just generally felt scared about civil rights and maybe separation of powers issues. And so it wasn't necessarily about the Muslim ban, but it was the ability to fight back. And what I always tell people about that night and the aftermath, the immediate aftermath, is a lot of people talk about it in political terms, that it was a beatback of President Trump and all that. And I sort of see it as what was important about it for me, and for me, even though I've been doing this so long, not to get jaded, and especially for you law students, is that the system we have is pretty remarkable, right? I mean, think about what happened that night. There were a lot of people who felt like maybe the judge made the wrong decision, or the judge shouldn't have issued the injunction nationwide, or she should have given the government an extra day to brief it. Those to me are fairly ancillary issues in the scheme of things, but what no one really questioned was that in our system, a single federal judge could hear the case and issue that injunction. And I think for a lot of people, they were nervous with the Trump administration because there had been a lot of talk about judges and disrespect for the rule of law. And I think for a lot of people, they took heart in it that it was important that we could fight back and the courts were still standing there and that we could go into court. And, I think when you do immigration, it's particularly startling sometimes because you're representing people who are coming from countries who that would be unheard of, to think that there'd be a neutral judge who could stop the president of the country from embarking on something that he felt he wanted to do or she wanted to do for national security reasons. And so I would just say as law students to think about that and not take for granted. People quibble, all judges are too active, but those, again, it's sort of, to me, those are critically important issues, but they're a level below the basic notion that in our country there's this kind of structure set up, and that for the most part people never question that the courts have a role and that we could go in there. So I think that was in a lot of ways the remarkable part of what happened. Now you all know that the president pulled back the first travel ban, issued a second one, and we won in the lower courts. Our case was out of Maryland, the Fourth Circuit. Hawaii also sued, and that case was out of the Ninth Circuit. It reached the Supreme Court, but ultimately was mooted out by the president issuing a third travel ban, which is going to be heard in April. The court has already stayed the lower court injunctions. So we'll see whether that's a definitive signal of what they're going to do. Who knows? And I'm happy to answer any questions, but there are people in the room who could equally speculate about what's going to happen. I think it's going to be a tough fight. We'll see what happens. The lower courts have been very adamant that the president either overstepped his statutory authority or violated the Establishment Clause. We'll see if the Supreme Court reacts the same way. What I thought I would do, though, is move on from the trial ban and obviously answer questions about it afterward, sort of tell you some of the other things that are going on that I'm seeing in the immigration work, because the Muslim ban has taken up a lot of the oxygen. But there is so much going on, and a lot of it goes under the radar screen that's causing real harm to immigrant communities. And so let me just sort of tick off a few of them. I see I'm running out of time. Okay. So some of the things that I'm working on now are SB4 in Texas. Texas has passed a law that says basically all cities, it's called an anti-sanctuary law, all cities, counties, towns in Texas need to cooperate with ICE. Some of it mandates cooperation, some of it just simply says the leaders in that city or county can't stop their local officers from working with ICE. That is an important case because what you're going to have is Texas, and if Texas prevails, we're waiting for a decision from the Fifth Circuit, I think you're going to see a lot of other states pass laws like this, and obviously there's stuff going on here in Indiana, that immigrants, and including people who are here lawfully, are now going to be walking around their towns worried about local police. Every traffic stop, every time they engage with a local police officer for whatever reason, are going to be concerned. And so we brought a lawsuit, and we are representing principally sheriffs and mayors and the towns and counties along the border. And some of them are pushing back from a pro-immigrant stance, and some of them are pushing back because they don't want to be told how to police their communities, how to use their resources, and they know that it's going to hurt their relationships with the community. So there's a lot at stake in that case. There's also, I just wanted to sort of as an aside mention this to you all because I know you all are not necessarily focused on immigration, might be looking at other areas. The case also raises important questions about state-local relationships that transcend immigration, right? The 10th Amendment, as many of you probably know, is generally thought to operate against the federal government commandeering state and local government functions. The general view has traditionally been that the 10th Amendment has nothing to say about the state-local relationship. And so what we're seeing around the country beyond immigration are a lot of cities, a lot of mayors doing a lot of innovative work and trying to protect vulnerable communities, progressive cities and towns trying to protect vulnerable communities, whether it's LGBT communities, whether it's race relations, some of it's wage laws, minimum wage laws, and more conservative state legislatures and governors stamping out that laws by doing what SB4 in Texas does, passing a preemptive state law. So for example, in Birmingham, they passed a minimum wage law raising the minimum wage. Alabama passed a law saying that has to be done, minimum wage is going to be dealt with at the state level. The same thing has happened with St. Louis and Kansas City, Cleveland with Ohio. We're going to see it in a lot of places. So I think the principle that may come out of SB4 is going to be important across the board on civil rights. We are also working with people crossing the border, largely from Central America, who are seeking asylum. And one of the things that you may have started to see in the paper, but I think you're going to see more of, and hopefully we at some point will challenge it, is the administration's decided they want to deter Central American asylum seekers. And so when a father or mother comes with their child, they used to put them in family detention centers, which we have pushed back against, but now the administration's decided that wasn't deterring asylum seekers from coming to a significant enough level. And so now what they've decided is they're going to separate the mother and her child, even if the child is 4, 5, 6, and 7, put the child in a different detention center, put the mother in another detention center, and in the hope that the mother will say, well, having my 4-year-old put in a detention center all by herself, the word's going to get back to Central America, don't come. And so what we've seen are dozens and dozens of cases of even fathers and mothers who have passed the credible fear asylum, the initial threshold screening. So these are not frivolous asylum claims, but still being separated. That's happening at the border and often sort of out of or under the radar. I am working on a lot of cases around the country, Boston, Detroit, LA, New Jersey, and other places, Miami, where the Trump administration is now going after large groups of individuals who have been living here a long time and trying to remove them. So Detroit, Christian Iraqis, Somalis in Miami, Christian Indonesians in New Hampshire, Boston, and New Jersey, Cambodians out of LA, but also around the country. And these are individuals who have lived here a long time. And our position is, if you're going to remove them after all this time, other prior administrations had let them sort of check in once a year, and they were living here peacefully and orderly, have built lives. You need to at least give them time to file new petitions, because most of them will be tortured or killed if sent back, especially Christian Iraqis. The administration said, no, we want to remove them. We're not going to give you time. So we've had to go to federal court just to get injunctions to give them time to go to immigration court. There are raids happening all over the country. And so there are a lot of things, and obviously we're happy to talk to you more about. I can't list them all now. I just wanted to end on, I just wanted to end on sort of a couple of sort of more personal notes about how I see being a lawyer and a public interest lawyer. And I hope these will sort of transcend an ACLU perspective or a left-right dichotomy. I think, immigration raises a lot of complicated issues and difficult issues. And what I would just say to you is, whether it's immigration or some area, just be involved in the issues of the day, regardless of whether you're on the so-called conservative side, the liberal side, where you're working, what you're doing. And working with people who are vulnerable in society, I think, one of the reasons is I think you're going to learn a lot from your clients. And I would just mention very quickly a story about these Central American women and their children who had been detained for like 18 months, and they were seeking asylum. And I'd go visit them every once in a while. And the more we lost in court, the more despondent I would become when I talked to them. And at one point, a few of the women, and these women were anywhere from 21 to 27. They were sitting in a detention center with their 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, and they pulled me aside and said, you got to keep your head up. We're strong, we're courageous, we're going to keep fighting. And it made me realize I got to get my head out of, and that I'm just in my own head here thinking I'm losing these cases and all that, and just the kind of courage they were showing was really remarkable. And it's I feel like you can't learn that in other places. And so it's worth trying to, once in a while, represent people who are that vulnerable. The other story I would just mention is when it happened when I was 25, and I guess sort of in my first year at the ACLU. And again, I think it just goes to sort of the importance of being a lawyer. And for you all, there's obviously to not be jaded about being lawyers. There's obviously, it's very easy to crack jokes about lawyers, and you hear on TV, oh my God, you're in law school, you're going to be another, and that's all we need is another lawyer. But just think about what it means to certain people and how vulnerable. So I went down to Austin to do a case, and when I, first year at the ACLU, and I was 25, and I met with someone who did grassroots work who was also only 25, but she had been doing it for a bunch of years, and we went to meet our client, who was a 20-year-old woman from Central America, who didn't speak English, and the person who did the grassroots work spoke perfect Spanish, and my Spanish was not that great, so it was a lot through translation. And she said to the woman, Lee has come down from New York, and he's a muy importante lawyer, and he's come to, and afterward, I said to her in a very glib way, said to the grassroots person, you should have said I was a muy importante lawyer, and a few months later, I sort of was going in my head, sort of thinking about the encounter, and I just, I realized how much wiser this woman who did the grassroots work was than I was, although we were both 25. She knew that this woman needed to hear that a lawyer was on her side. She was here in America all by herself. She was scared, vulnerable, and this woman knew that what this client needed to know is that an important lawyer has come down from New York. She's not all alone. A real lawyer is going to help her. And, for all of us who have a much different relationship with the government and society and don't feel that kind of vulnerability, being scared all the time, it's hard to really imagine what it's like for someone, that young woman came from Central America, to feel like someone is on her side and that an actual lawyer is on her side. So I would just stress to you that no matter where you go in your careers, whether it's a company, a firm, wherever, try to stay involved in the issues, maybe take a pro bono case and meet people who need your help. And remember, sort of the best traditions of the legal profession are helping vulnerable people. And it doesn't mean you need to do it every second of your life, but try to the extent you can, because you are in a really important position to have that law degree and be a lawyer. So I would just end with that, and I hope you'll keep that in mind. Thanks. Hi.
Oh, thank you. Hi, I'm Ben. I'm a first-year student. When I'm not here in Indiana, I live in New York, and I was one of those people at JFK and later outside the courthouse that day.
Wow.
And so I want to thank you for all the great work you do, not only on that, but
Thank you for
in
being
general.
there. And you were really there, right? Because now it's like if people say
I
they
was
were
really
at
there.
the 7th game of the World Series, like 4 million people have told me. No,
I was really there. I had some friends call me in the afternoon and say they're detaining people at JFK,
right.
and we jumped in a car and went out there. But I was hoping, given that we're all going to be heading out into the world as lawyers, I was hoping you could talk about the lawyers who showed up at the airports and drafted all those
Right.
briefs and motions, and the role that they played in that moment of showing up to be the rapid response teams.
Right.
I was hoping you could talk about that
Yeah,
impact.
I think that was enormous, because the ACLU is big relative to other civil rights organizations, but it's still not that big relative to the Justice Department. And so we could not have done it without all those people. And I don't feel like we did it. It was the groups that we were working with who happened to go to federal court, but the equally important part of it was all the lawyers at the airport. And so it was a critical part of it, and it's sort of part of this whole civil rights movement where people are getting involved. And one of the things I was able to do after that night is organize a rapid response network with about 70 of the biggest law firms in the country who have all decided they need to step up. And it's interesting because one of the things they've said to me is, be careful when you talk to the press about this rapid response network, because we don't want it to look political. Our partners, needless to say, like any segment of society, some are pro this administration, some are not. And what I've always told people is that I think what the firms are doing is really just stepping up in the best traditions of the legal profession and saying there are people who need representation. We're going to represent them. And it doesn't even just mean that they necessarily have to have an overriding view. DACA's right, DACA's not right, the Muslim ban's right, it's not right. But just as lawyers saying, these are vulnerable people, we're going to represent a client. And I think that's how I viewed people going out there, is just, we're law students, lawyers, we can help, there's vulnerable people here, and we don't even necessarily need to have a view about the larger immigration debate, which people can reasonably disagree with. And so I think, in my mind, the people out there did as much or more than I think that we did in that one filing. Right. Yeah. Oh, you mean statewide or right? So you do have a good mayor, right? I assume everyone knows who you're. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, so I don't know. Is anybody here from our state affiliate? No. Okay. Okay, great. So, I mean, that's one thing I feel like to reach out because they will have a much better sense of how to work with the legislature. I think certainly convincing them not to pass Texas-type laws is the first step. And so that's what's going on around the country now. We're fighting to keep other states from passing those laws. And so that's certainly something I'd like to do. There are also then states that want to push ahead can do pro-immigrant type things. And I think California has been at the lead. And so I'm happy to talk to you after or talk to a group of people and put you in touch with our advocacy and legislative departments who are pushing pro-immigrant bills, because I think there are a lot of things. I mean, everything from California now trying to get rid of old minor convictions that can render you deportable to passing pilot programs to fund counsel for people in immigration. I think many of you may know, but not all of you, that although your life is at stake, your liberty is at stake in deportation proceedings, there's no right to counsel. If you're lucky enough to find pro bono counsel or can afford it, you can bring counsel, but there's no public defenders. So there are pilot projects at the local level now to fund counsel. So there's a whole variety of things, but I do think that's where a lot of the action is now, not just in immigration, but across the board. And so that would be, if anybody is interested, and I would love to talk to you about it and put you in touch with the right people. And certainly the state ACLU will have their finger on the pulse there.
Hi. This may be too specific a question for right now, but so last summer I was lucky enough to work with the Southern Poverty Law Center at the Stewart Detention Center with the sci-fi team, and among all the many
Immigration Detention Center in Georgia.
Mm-hmm. And among all the things that I got to experience and see there, of all the atrocities I saw, one that stood out to me as a law student and a future lawyer was the lack of accountability for immigration law judges. And while I was there, the team put out a report asking for the disbarment of a sitting judge at the time. And I was wondering, because of the administrative role that they play and the lack of accountability, how can we as future lawyers keep our immigration judges accountable? And
right. Yeah, I mean, so that just to sort of give everyone a sense that the immigration judges, when a basic immigration case proceeds, you go to an immigration judge, a single judge, it's the trial level. Then there's an administrative board called the Board of Immigration Appeals you can appeal to, and then there's judicial review, although that's been significantly curtailed back since 1996. It's one of the issues that we're fighting. But the immigration judge and Board of Immigration Appeals decisions can be overturned by the Attorney General. That doesn't happen that often, but I think we're going to see it happening more now. What happens is the Attorney General can certify an issue to himself or herself. And so Attorney General Sessions has already certified a big issue. So there's that problem. They're not Article III neutral judges. They can be directed in certain respects from above. One of the ways is obviously getting into court, and that's why we've fought so hard to keep the federal courts with jurisdiction over immigration matters. But not every case can make it to federal court, and it's very difficult for the federal courts to completely supervise it. I think another way is, of course, observing the cases, right? And so we've fought hard not to let the courtrooms be closed, and it would be great to start having more pilot projects where law students just sit in, because just the fact that the immigration judge sees someone there taking notes can be very, very important. Ultimately, though, you need lawyers as well to keep them accountable. and the statistics are startling in the immigration area, as you probably saw. People with lawyers do exponentially better than people with non-lawyers. And people with non-lawyers, the hearings tend to go very quickly. They don't know what they're doing. And so I think all those ways, but I think you're raising an important point about thinking of innovative strategies to keep immigration judges. I would also like to see more law students start to go be clerks for immigration judges of the Board of Immigration, because there started to be an honors program to take good law students to do those clerkships, and that could end up being critical, where it was never really on the radar screen for people in the past. I think the Obama administration started the programs. Whether they continue, I don't know, but that's another way of, if you're a diligent law student, sitting as a judge, we can't just shaft that, And the other thing is that I don't want to disparage immigration judges across the board. A lot of it is just they're overworked. There's just need to be more immigration judges. They don't generally have law clerks, and so the sheer barrage of cases can overwhelm them, and it can make it seem as if they are purposely not doing their job when it could just be the sheer overload. But I'm happy to talk to you more about it because it is fairly, specific. But Professor Johnson, yeah.
Your comment about the great tradition of lawyers representing vulnerable people and not necessarily having to agree with any, meta, big, one side or the other of the political debate made me think about when you talk about the fact that the Trump administration has been preventing undocumented young women who are seeking to have abortions. They're physically restraining them, trying to prevent them from exercising that right. And then equally important, I think, to your point, is how the Trump administration reacted to the ACLU's representation of those young women.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. So just quickly, for those of you who don't know, there are asylum seekers, again, coming from Central America, and they're put in detention centers, and they're minors, but they might be 16, 17, and they are pregnant and they want to have an abortion. There are people who are willing to pay for the abortion, or the clinic's going to do it for free. There are people who are going to facilitate it, but the Trump administration has decided they won't even let them out of the detention center to have the abortion. And so, right, obviously abortion is an explosive issue, but the law as it stands now is you have a right to have an abortion. And these are minors, but they've already got a judicial bypass, or there's someone signing off on it. And we have been representing them. And the administration has come after us, as Professor John said, very, very hard, which to me is a real shift in what's going on. And the administration, we got an injunction. The administration dawdled going to the Supreme Court to try and get a stay from the Supreme Court. And in the meantime, we got the young woman an abortion. And the administration went to the Supreme Court and asked the Supreme Court to sanction us because, and we said, hey, we were lawyering, you should have got off. But the fact that the administration actually went to the U.S. Supreme Court and criticized us, just as Professor Johnson says, seems like a real shift. And one of the interesting things is that a lawyer named Phillips, who's one of the preeminent Supreme Court practitioners in the country, who has argued 70 plus cases in the Supreme Court and is generally viewed as very conservative, actually represented us in the Supreme Court, saying, what are you doing? You can't sanction the ACLU for doing their job. But I think you're right to point that out, that it's very important not to let the administration intimidate you into not being a zealous advocate. It's just what lawyers have always done, and I think the way Professor Johnson put it as sort of that meta issues, you don't have to agree down the line on everything the ACLU does or other public interest groups, but when you get that client and you humanize that client and see what this particular client needs, and you go to court for them, it's really, that's what lawyering is. right? And so you all are really in that position. That's, it's all fine to joke about being a lawyer, and I do it, but it's an important and a really important role in society, and maybe becoming that much more important. Sorry, I think. Right.
So I wonder if you might be able to speak beyond the role of representing individual clients about what you might have future lawyers do as engaged citizens.
Yeah, that's interesting. Slightly above my pay grade, but no. I think that's a really interesting point, because one of the things I would say just at a minimum is whatever you're going to end up doing in court or sort of legal advocacy, stay informed on these major issues, because you're all smart, and the one thing you don't want to do is take, and it's becoming increasingly hard not to do it, is take all your information about a particular issue from sound bites on the media. So I think part of being an engaged citizen is just being informed and being able to correct people. And one of the interesting things when I've been going into court recently around the country is this whole narrative about immigration at this abstract level. Immigrants are dangerous, immigrants are bad. And the judges have been reading the affidavits about these individuals and actually commenting in open court to the government saying, well, this individual has been here 30 years. Yes, they have a drug possession from 30 years ago, and you're just continually calling them a criminal. And yes, technically they have a conviction, but it seems as though they have had 2 kids serve in the U.S. military, they've started a business, and so just being able to know the facts about what's going on, are immigrants really a drain on the economy? Those types of things I think are critical. Beyond court, I think just the sort of engaging as a citizen in sort of advocacy, whether it's being at the airport, even as a non-lawyer, just sort of protesting or pushing back. I think all those things are critical. I think absolutely just being engaged as a citizen. It doesn't have to only be in court. My point was only, and I think it's consistent with your point, is you do have a special skill. You are allowed to represent people, so do that, but also, as importantly, be an engaged citizen. Absolutely.
Sorry, just as a quick follow-up. So we know, if we read the statistics, we know that like 99% of immigrants, 99.9, are law-abiding citizens.
Right.
But then we get these stories. I mean, just in Indiana, over the weekend, there was the Colts player
right,
that got killed. How do we, when we see those stories and certain members of the political spectrum grab onto that to say that and generalize it?
Right.
How do we control the narrative or discuss it?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I mean, whenever anything like that happens, I immediately get a call from Tucker Carlson's producer. Why don't you come on? And then whenever I say I'll come, I also, but do you want to talk about these other cases I have about the Iraqi Christians being sent back without? No, we don't have time on the show for that. And I agree, it is very tricky because those are explosive, and you never ever want to be cavalier about a crime like that or death. We struggle with how to do it. We are increasing our advocacy and communications departments so we can figure out. I don't think you ever want to be glib about it, but you also need to push back and say, yes, there are going to be immigrants who do bad things, but the statistics show, and I think there's an article in the Times today about it, I think there is, about how immigrants actually commit less crimes, and the solution is not to bar all immigrants. And and just the ACLU doesn't advocate for open borders. So if someone has a horrendous crime, we say they have procedural rights to a hearing, but we're not saying everyone has a right. I mean, other groups do take that position. And so I think it's a combination of saying, look, No one's condoning an immigrant committing a crime, and if it's a serious enough crime, they're going to get removed. But the solution can't be that we then blur everyone. But is that an easy message to get through to people when it's hard, right? And it's very easy to demagogue against immigrants, and they have no political clout, and so I think that's what makes it really challenging, right? They're not going to go to the voting, at least while they're non-citizens, go to the voting booth. But it is hard, and that's something that dramatic happens, and it's a player for the cults, and so it increases the level. You know, and I don't have any simple answers, but I can tell you're asking the right question, and it's something we struggle with all the time.
With that, please join me in thanking you.